Okay, everyone, and welcome to today's SD Times webinar called The Journey to Organization-Wide Scrum. I'm Rubenstein, Editor-in-Chief of SD Times, and I'm glad you've decided to take this journey with us today. Joining me is Steve McConnell, well-known author of many books on software development best practices, and CEO and Chief Software Engineer at Construx. As we've reported in SD Times, Scrum is the most implemented Agile process today. A study by BZ Research, a sister organization to SD Times, showed that 39% of development shops polled were using Scrum. Now that's up from 31% in 2009. Yet SD Times blogger J.D. Hildebrand cautioned in a recent post that it's not enough for organizations to do Agile, they must become Agile. Now, one of the knocks on Agile development and the ability to transform your organization into one that can rapidly adapt to market changes and business opportunities is that it's hard to implement Agile practices across large distributed organizations. One Agile expert noted in an interview with me earlier this year, he said, it's hard to implement a lot of things across large distributed organizations. So we'll be taking a look at that. Before I bring in Steve to discuss some of the lessons learned from helping organizations bring Scrum into their shops, I have just a couple of quick announcements. Today's program is going to be followed by a live Q&A session. To ask a question, you would just navigate down to the lower right corner of your interface, type in the question, and hit submit, and we'll get to as many as time allows. This webinar is going to be available on demand in the webinar section of sdtimes.com in the next day or so you can watch and listen over and over again to your heart's content. Now, I'm honored to introduce Construx CEO and Chief Engineer Steve McConnell. Steve?
Thank you. Thank you for that nice introduction. Well, I am happy to be here today to talk about the journey to organization-wide Scrum. I suppose we ought to start by just giving some background on what my orientation is and what my view is of Scrum. And so I should start by saying that I am, at this point in history, pro-Scrum. As was just mentioned in the introductory comments, I think I agree with the fact that Scrum has emerged as the best of breed of Agile practices. And I would say, moreover, that my company, Construx Software, is also pro-Scrum, that we recommend it often, and we actually at this point provide a pretty extensive array of training and consulting services related to Scrum. The reason we are enthusiastic about Scrum is that we see far more successes with Scrum than failures, and that was something that back in 2001, 2002 wasn't clear yet. There were a lot of Agile practices that seemed promising. The one that has emerged as the most promising, I think, is Scrum. As far as this talk is concerned, I think we tend to learn more from failures than from successes. So the emphasis of this talk really is more on the failures. But that should not be interpreted as being negative about Scrum. The reason that we're talking about this topic at all is that overall we're enthusiastic about Scrum. So let me start by telling a story. And there will be several stories in this talk. This first story is a case study in how not to implement Scrum. And in this particular case study, we had a team that was very interested in doing Scrum. They had read a book about Scrum and they decided they wanted to implement it. So they got in from their project manager and they asked their business to provide an on-site customer. The business was not able to provide an on-site customer, but they provided someone part-time, and the team decided that that was good enough. The team didn't have a clear sense of how long the project would take, and so but the team did commit to monthly sprints, to daily stand-ups, to sprint planning, to end-of-sprint retrospectives, and so on. And so really committed to doing Scrum by the book. And so they began their first couple of iterations. And in iteration number 1, they began defining requirements for their first sprint. They put other requirements into the product backlog. They began coding and showing working software to their in-house customer. And they were very good about keeping the software at a potentially releasable level of quality. That is, a very high level of quality. They delivered iteration number 1 with high quality. They then moved to iteration number 2, continued to do Scrum by the book, and delivered iteration number 2, also with high quality. Now, when they got to iteration number 3, they started asking some questions. Asked questions like, when are you going to be done? And the team said, we don't really know yet. Committing to a long-term end date isn't really how Agile projects are done. The business asked, where is the full requirements specification for this project? The team said, Well, defining full requirements up front isn't agile. We are remaining flexible so that we can respond to the needs of the business throughout the project. And the business asked, well, how much will this project cost overall? And the team said, we're focusing on delivering the highest possible business value in each iteration. You can shut down the project anytime, and we'll still have delivered high business value. By iteration number 4, the business was beginning to push back hard. And they said, this is just not the way our business operates. The team responded by bringing in an Agile consultant to explain to the business Agile would deliver the highest possible business value by always focusing on doing the next most valuable thing. Agile consultant met with the business's leaders and explained how they should reorganize their business to take advantage of the new possibilities created by Agile. Well, iteration number 5 came along, and the CEO shut down the project without making use of its partially completed work. The project was relaunched with a new project leader and new team members as a waterfall project, and the CEO banned the words Agile and Scrum from ever being uttered in his presence again. And so this is a very grim case study in Scrum implementation, and we'll do a post-mortem on this, or a retrospective on this project. But first I want to give a little bit more background on my perspective, give a brief history of my company, Construx, and our involvement with Scrum. So as far as my company is concerned, our focus has always been on software development best practices. In case that's hard to read on the slide, it's this part right here. In case that's not clear enough, it's this part underlined right here. So best practices. We recommend practices to our clients that have been proven to work. We are not primarily a Scrum shop or primarily an Agile shop. We are a best practices shop, and to the degree that Scrum is a best practice, we would recommend that. Now, back in 2000 through 2004, there really were few established best practices in Agile, and at that time we did not feel there had been enough industry experience accumulated to recommend Agile or Scrum practices in the early 2000s. And so in the early 2000s we were slow to recommend Agile practices, really by design. But about 2005, which is 6 years ago now, we believed that Scrum had really begun to emerge as the best of breed of the Agile practices. And so at that point we began to focus on Scrum. And I think we were then, and we are now, standing on the shoulders of lessons learned, both failures and successes. And, you know, it isn't 1999 anymore. We have accumulated a lot of lessons learned, and so we definitely are in a position to make some recommendations about Scrum in particular, and perhaps about other Agile practices that haven't worked out so well and that we would recommend avoiding. Now, the background on my company that I should mention is that we usually work with technical organizations that are in the staff range of about 100 to 1,000 people. We work with some organizations smaller and some organizations that are larger, but that's really kind of the center of the bell curve for us. And so that has some implications for our exposure to Scrum too. We haven't seen a lot of projects in companies that only have 6 or 7 technical staff. We normally are working with companies that have pretty good sized technical staffs. The other thing I should point out is where we tend to get involved. And typically, if you look at the Scrum adoption in an organization, there will be a phase shown on the left of this green line where the group starting to, or the company is starting to dip its toe in the water and beginning to talk about Scrum, and then the period of more rapid adoption, and then there's a leveling off. Well, the fact of the matter is, my company doesn't see a lot of organizations that are in this very far left part of the Scrum adoption curve. We tend to get involved more in the middle of the curve, and typically we get involved maybe after the first project failed, and companies have read about great things about Scrum and they can't understand why their project failed, so they bring us in to help them understand why it didn't work. Or more commonly, we get brought in when an organization is uncertain how to roll out Scrum beyond the first project, or sometimes we get brought in when the rollout to the second project failed and the organization succeeded on their first project. They can't figure out why it didn't work, why the same thing didn't work on their second project. And often these days we're getting brought in because companies are uncertain how to scale Scrum to larger projects. And so they've had it work on small projects, but in larger organizations, a lot of the projects they do are in fact larger projects, and so They want to take some of that secret sauce that's worked on small projects and scale it up to large projects, but they're not sure how to do that. And finally, it's very common these days, in fact, far more common than not, for the organizations we work with to have development teams spread across multiple locations. And so there can be some uncertainty about how to scale Scrum to multiple geos, and we help companies with that too. So we tend to get involved in a little bit later in the adoption sequence. Next thing, another way of looking at Scrum adoption that I personally find very insightful is to look at it from the point of view of what has been called the innovation adoption sequence. And this was originally proposed by Everett Rogers in his classic book, Diffusion of Innovation, and it's popularized by Jeffrey Moore in his very popular book, Crossing the Chasm. And the key point here is that back in 2000, Scrum was really being adopted by innovators. We were very early in the adoption sequence, and it was really the pioneers that were adopting Scrum. In 2004, 2005, when Construx started to become more enthusiastic about Scrum, we were definitely in the early adopter phase. And today, I think we're getting into the early majority phase. So, and the numbers that were cited in the introduction, about 39% of organizations are using Scrum to some degree, would definitely support that. That puts, mathematically, that puts Scrum into the early majority category. The key thing to recognize here, though, is that the attributes of individuals and organizations that are in the innovator category versus the early adopter category versus the early majority category are significantly different. And so one of the ways that we find organizations getting tripped up is assuming that they can use the same adoption techniques as they try to spread Scrum throughout their organization. And this tends not to be true because the pilot projects tend to be done by innovators or maybe early adopters, and once the organization wants to roll out Scrum more broadly, they have to roll it out to people who, as individuals, tend to be more in the early majority or perhaps even the late majority category. And so you need to really look at the differences in approaches of people in these different categories. In the early adopter category, early adopters tend to be attracted to innovation because of the prospect of grand slam home run, of huge wins. And they're willing to make a significant bet or take on significant risk in order to pursue that big win. An early majority is attracted less on the basis of novelty, more on the basis of being able to access some competitive advantage for the business. And so the innovation can't just be novel, it actually has to be proved more useful. And that emphasis is on the word proved more useful. The people in the early majority want to see examples of success stories. They're not really risk averse, but they want there to be a reason to take on the risk, and they want it to be a calculated risk, whereas people in the innovator and early adopter category aren't such about risk calculation. They're more just about pursuing the latest and greatest thing. The early adopters are going for huge wins, something that will basically let them have one big win and retire. The early majority is really going after more predictable wins. They are willing to take some risk, but they want to have a good assurance that the win will actually be there. Early adopters are highly risk tolerant. Early majority are not risk averse, but again, they want there to be a good, solid reason for taking on the risk. The early adopters tend to be highly nimble, and they tend to embrace change, which makes them philosophically a really good fit for Agile specifically. Early majority is not change averse, but they're not highly nimble either, which makes them a little bit of a less natural fit for the overall message that has been packaged with Scrum and Agile. And so I think overall, the early adopters and innovators were an outstanding fit for Agile. The early majority is still a good fit for Agile once the benefits are proven, but the benefits really have to be proven before they're going to adopt. And so this really, I think, once we understand this taxonomy of how people adopt innovations, it really helps to explain a lot about why some Scrum adoptions work well and why some Scrum adoptions fail, and also about why some early Scrum adoptions work, but later Scrum adoptions fail, even within the same organization. So now turn our attention back to that story of the failed Scrum implementation and take a look at why that didn't work nearly as well as anybody would have hoped. I think learning number one in this really has to be that Agile is a strategy, not a goal. When the team said, we're not going to provide predictability because that's not the Agile way, that's not how Agile works, that is really confusing means and ends. The business doesn't really care whether what you're doing is called Agile or whether what you're doing is called Scrum. They care about what you're doing because it provides higher business value. And I think one of the great misconceptions about the Agile movement is this idea that business highly value flexibility. And indeed the word Agile is driven by that consideration, the notion that businesses really need flexibility. In fact, what I have concluded is that businesses generally want predictability more than they want flexibility. And sure, businesses will take flexibility if they can get it without sacrificing predictability, but I have spent the last 10 years asking upper executives, if you could have either predictability or flexibility, which would you choose? And at least 90% will say, I would choose predictability, because our business lives and dies based on the commitments we make and the commitments we meet. And if I can't make fairly confident, longer-range predictions to my customers and my finance department, saying where I'm going to be and how much it's going to cost and with what quality level 6 months from now, 12 months from now, then I can't even operate my business. And so predictability is really key, I think, is really key to understanding why some Agile implementations fail. The other consideration the other conclusion that I have come to over the last several years is that businesses would rather be wrong than vague. And Agile basically asks businesses to say, trust us that we are going to deliver always be delivering the next highest business value thing. We can't tell you where we're going to go exactly. We can't tell you where we're going to end up. We can't tell you exactly how much it's going to cost. But the process is going to guarantee that at any given point in time, you've always got the highest business value that we could have delivered at that point in time. And while that argument is theoretically appealing, I think from most businesses' point of view, it simply represents a posture that is impossible for the business to occupy. Businesses would rather plant a stake in the ground and say, we're going to go here and operate for a couple months and realize they were wrong and then change course and plant a new stake in the ground, then they would plant no stake in the ground whatsoever. So I really believe businesses would rather be wrong than vague. And I would invite people participating in this webinar to reflect on your own experiences and ask yourself about your interactions with the business. Is there anything that would cause you to disbelieve that claim? Or does maybe the idea that businesses would rather be wrong than vague explain some of the more difficult interactions you've had around Agile and around Scrum, and maybe explain why the business has resisted in some cases? So learning one, Agile is not a strategy. It is a strategy, it's not a goal. On the flexibility versus predictability point, I'm not saying there are no businesses that value flexibility, but I'm saying most businesses seem to value predictability more. So don't just assume the business needs or wants flexibility just because some Agile or Scrum pundits have said that they do. Also, don't assume the business is willing to trade predictability for flexibility because that's often not true either. The other thing I would point out is that Agile is not an all-or-nothing proposition. If we are Agile, we do not have to be Agile in everything. And the conclusion that Construx, my company, has come to is that the big trouble point here is trying to be Agile in the requirements. That is, not committing to a feature set so that the business has an idea of where that stake is planted in the ground. What we really want to do is really not be so Agile in requirements, but to actually be more Agile in the Agile planning part of it. And the nice thing about that is if we are Agile in our planning, that actually helps us overcome obstacles and do a better job of supporting predictability in the combination of feature set, schedule, and cost. And one of the ironies here, and one of the great frustrations for me over the last 10 years or so, is that is being sold typically flexibility, but actually if you do it right, the practices support a greatly enhanced level of predictability. And so if we do Agile right, we can actually sell to our business, we can sell Scrum on the basis of enhanced support for predictability. So it's been greatly frustrating to me that we've seen a number of projects fail in their organizations, specifically because the teams have kind of drunk the Agile Kool-Aid and are trying to sell the practices on the basis of flexibility, and that's not what their businesses want. I already made this point. Businesses live or die on the basis of their commitments, and I think I've made this point too, that if you are pursuing agility at the expense of making or meeting commitments, you are probably headed toward failure. And I'm not saying that's the way it should be. I'm saying that my observation is that that's the way it is. Learning number 3 is that the recommended approach, and that you read in some of the literature, of trust us, we're doing Scrum, doesn't work. And what the team basically did in the case study was they said, trust us, we're doing Agile. If you trust us now, we will show you results that indicate that your trust was in fact a good judgment. But that really can't be the beginning point. That's really more of the end point. Trust then verify is backwards. Businesses want verify and then trust. And so basically, I think that it's possible in some organizations for teams eventually to get to the point that the team in the case study described, where once they have built a track record of on-time delivery and of predictability and of being a dependable business partner for the business, then they'll be able to move toward a higher trust relationship where they actually are able to say, we will always be doing the next most valuable thing. But you can't start there. That's where you end up. And the reality is that because in our industry, most organizations have a long history of the software function overrunning its budget, under-delivering functionality, overrunning its schedule, and so on, most businesses really don't trust their software function. So we can't start out from a basis of assuming that there's trust. We have to build that trust, and then maybe, if it really is a value to the business, we can work toward the business trusting us more and having a more flexible relationship. Learning number 4. Scrum does not give you the ability to boil the ocean. And Ken Schwaber, one of the founders of Scrum, is very fond of saying that Scrum doesn't solve your problems, it exposes your problems, it shines a bright light on your problems so that you can see what they are. And I think that that's true. I think that Scrum makes it harder to ignore, much harder to ignore some of the problems that organizations often expose, not with Scrum, but with software development in general. And Scrum is a way of surfacing those problems and making them more visible. And so I think that's true. The caution here, though, is that the fact that you expose a problem does not necessarily mean that you have the authority or permission to fix the problem, and it also doesn't mean that everything that gets exposed that from the development point of view looks like a problem. And so we've seen a failure mode with Scrum teams where they will expose problems and they will start trying to surface problems, and they will think that the business will automatically go along with that. A lot of times the business says no. And so in the case study where the Scrum consultant comes in and says, hey, look at all the great potential offered by Scrum, let's reorganize the business to take advantage of this potential, that's, I think, a pretty typical case where the business is going to say, look, this theoretically might be okay, but we're not going to reorganize the whole business based on speculation that this might help. And so I think people at the technical level and the technical leadership level need to be realistic about how many problems they're actually going to get permission to solve, and they need to focus on the problems that are at their level and can be solved at their level. All right, so let's turn to story number 2, and this is also a very typical pattern that we have seen. Is an initial success followed by a failure in a second project. In this case, there was a team that had adopted Scrum, similar to the first team that I mentioned. But in this particular case, this first team succeeded wildly. They had taken over ownership of a project that had been floundering. They applied Scrum practices by the book. Suddenly, they began to get traction on a project that had seemed almost impossible previously. The business partners were wildly enthusiastic about the success of this team on Scrum. They loved it, and they wanted to propagate Scrum organization-wide so they could realize the benefits organization-wide. So the second team they tried it with was a new team. The second team was not quite as wildly enthusiastic or bought into Scrum, and they didn't follow all the aspects of Scrum. They didn't see the value in keeping the software, for example, at a potentially releasable quality level at all times. They also let iterations slide to be a little bit longer than 1 month. And the second project was then not successful, and it didn't do better than their traditional development approaches, and this project was in fact overall not viewed as a success. And so the retrospective on this is I think there are a number of lessons we can learn from that example. One is that we have seen many times now that teams that try to adopt Scrum and don't do it by the book may fail. It doesn't mean they will fail, it means that they may fail. And we, as a company, we have adopted the position that says, if you're doing Scrum, and you have, or what you call Scrum, and you have made some adaptations that you think are a good idea, and Scrum is working fine for you, then fine. We're not going to second guess that, and we'll say that looks good. If you are using Scrum and you're doing it by the book, and it's working well, we're going to second guess that either. We're going to say, great, I'm glad that's working for you. But if you are using what you call Scrum, and you're not doing it by the book, and it's not working for you, then our position is the first thing you need to do is revert to doing Scrum by the book. If you're not really doing Scrum and it's failing, then Scrum is not really failing. Some other variation is failing. And so the first thing you need to do is actually adopt by the book Scrum and give it an honest chance to work, because we've seen that work many, many times, and we really do think at this point it's an industry best practice, and so that really has to be the first line of approach. So that is one retrospective, I think, is first of all make sure you're doing it right. The second aspect of this retrospective, I think, goes back to that innovation adoption sequence, which is to say that you can't assume that the steps you took to have Scrum succeed with early adopters or innovators going to be sufficient for Scrum to succeed with early majority or late majority people in your organization. Typically, early adopters don't need a lot of training. They're highly motivated. They're willing to read the book. Early majority typically want training or need training, or they're not going to do it without the training. Innovators and early adopters typically don't need much coaching because they're motivated. They'll talk to each other. They will be inventive about how they overcome obstacles. Early majority basically wants other people to already have figured out most of the obstacles, and they want someone to tell them how to overcome the obstacles. Innovators and early adopters are highly tolerant of mistakes or of faults in the process. They're willing to say, look, we are willing to power through these obstacles to get to the potential for huge benefit on the other side. Whereas early majority tend to look at mistakes or faults in the process as indications that the process is not actually a good process, and look at it as a reason to discard the process and revert to more familiar work practices. Innovators and early adopters tend to be willing to apply significant amounts of personal energy to close gaps where something's not explained. And again, early majority, shown in the blue segment of the graph, is really not willing to apply the same amount of personal energy to close gaps. They typically will view those more as obstacles that can't be overcome. And so I think this idea of the innovation adoption curve actually is extremely insightful for looking at why an organization sometimes will have good success on a pilot project, but then will have more difficulty trying to roll out that same approach to a broader audience. So let's now to story number 3. And this is a story of initial success with Scrum, followed by basically nothing. In this case, organization had a first team that adopted Scrum. They were very successful, and the organization said, we want more of this. We want other teams to be successful. And so they tried to recruit a second team, and they could not get a second team to adopt Scrum. And when I talked to the VP, who was a well-read, knowledgeable, smart guy, he said, well, the reason we couldn't get anybody else to do Scrum is people were tolerant of this daily stand-up meetings and that kind of thing, but we couldn't figure out how to make TDD, test-driven development, work with our large legacy code base. The teams didn't want to do continuous integration. They were very lukewarm about pair programming. And for those of you who are knowledgeable about Scrum, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking the same thing I was thinking, which is, well, continuous integration and TDD and pair programming don't have anything to do with Scrum. But there I was, sitting with a very intelligent, well-read VP of a large software organization, and he had actually not made the distinction. He had not made the distinction between all these other practices, which are really more associated with extreme programming, versus Scrum. And once I said to him, hey, you realize that continuous integration and TDD and pair programming are actually not required to do Scrum. Those are other Agile practices, but we've seen lots of teams succeeding with Scrum without those practices. The light went off for him, and he immediately said, oh, yeah, right, of course. And that actually made it easier for other teams to take up Scrum because they had lowered the bar for what other teams actually needed to do. And so I think the retrospective here, or the learnings here, are first of all that Scrum and Agile are not the same thing. Scrum is a much more specific concept than Agile, and I think that when you try to broaden it, sometimes that actually doesn't work. The second thing that I think about in the context of this project is a conversation that I had with a guy probably 10 years ago or so, almost 10 years ago. And this guy had been an officer in the Marines, and he said, you know, what I've been thinking about lately is I've been thinking about what is my minimal software process. He said, you know, when I was in the Marines, I could tell you what the minimum I needed to be successful or to hold a position was. He said, you know, if I'm in a forward position and I've got air cover and I've got artillery support and I've got a bunch of guys holding down a position, you know, what can I do without? He said, can I do without my communications? Well, you know, I don't really want my communications to go down, but if they go down, I can probably be okay without my communications. Then he said, what about air support? You know, I can lose air support. I don't really need air support. So I can still hold the position without air support. And he said, well, what about artillery support? So I really, really don't want to lose my artillery support. Losing my artillery support is a big deal. But if that goes down, I can still hold the position. It's going to be hard, but I can still hold the position. And he said, you know, really, the last thing I need to hold a position is I need to be able to lay down at least 2 interlocking lines of lead. I can't lay down at least 2 interlocking lines of lead. Then I can be overrun and I'm dead. But as long as I can lay down 2 interlocking lines of lead, that's what I need as a minimum. So what is the software equivalent of that? So he got me thinking about that probably close to 10 years ago. And I actually think Scrum is pretty close to the answer to that question. I think Scrum really is quite a minimal process. We don't need to pile on necessarily extra stuff like continuous integration or TDD. Those might be good ideas in a lot of cases, and in some cases they might not be. But the point is, they are not part of the minimum of what we need. And Scrum really, I think, is a pretty good description of the minimum we need for a project to be successful. And I think that's one reason that Scrum has itself been so successful, and that the companies that have taken on Scrum or have adopted Scrum have normally continued to want to use it because it really helps them out. All right, story number 4. This story is actually not about Scrum. This was about extreme programming, but the nature of the failure could just as easily have happened with a Scrum project, and so I include it here as a cautionary tale nonetheless. So in this project, we had an organization that made a huge organizational commitment to Agile. This was within a well-known products company, software products company, bought into an Agile development book, hook, line, and sinker in the 2002 timeframe. They committed their 200-person dev organization to this Agile approach. They began doing monthly iterations, and they were quite disciplined about it. They actually brought in coaches to help them make sure they did the work by the book. They were quite disciplined about doing the work by the book, including doing their requirements work just in time. So at the beginning of each iteration, they would look at the requirements that they needed to do in that iteration, and they were always doing the next most valuable thing. The team proceeded in this mode for about 18 months, always doing the next most valuable thing, based on the assumption that that would lead to, at any given point in time, the highest value product they could possibly have produced in that amount of time. But at the end of 18 months, even after 18 iterations, the team had not produced a coherent product that the business felt was viable in the marketplace. So at that point, the company shut down the project, laid off 200 staff, and wrote off a $50 million loss. So, as I said, this is quite a strong cautionary tale. On the retrospective on this project, I think we've seen some of these causes of failure before. One is that Agile is not the goal, it's a strategy, and essentially in this project, the team did not keep Stephen Covey's guideline in 7 Habits of Highly Successful People in mind. They did not begin with the end in mind. They didn't know what the end was. They were focused on the process, not on the business end. I think of this kind of thing in terms of hiking analogy, where if I'm doing hiking in the backcountry, I need to have some point on the horizon that I'm hiking to. So I'm going to climb up to the top of a hill. I'm going to look for some landmark on the horizon. And once I go down the hill, I'm not necessarily going to be able to see that landmark, and I'm not going to be able to proceed in a straight path toward that landmark. I'm going to have to detour to go around to follow the terrain, or maybe to avoid a river or something like that. But from time to time, I'm going to pop my head up and I'm going to look at that landmark, and I'm going to make sure that in a general way, I am headed in that general direction. And I think that's what this team did not do. They never had a point on the horizon that they were headed toward, and as a result, they didn't head toward anything, and that led to the business shutting down the project. And this lack of comprehensive project vision really is what we have seen as the most common cause of Scrum failure. Even though this case study was not about Scrum, it illustrates what we have seen as the most common cause of Scrum failure. And I honestly don't think that this should really be that much of a surprise. I've been working in the software industry for 27 years now, and requirements problems have been the #1 cause of problems the entire time I've been in the software industry. Scrum hasn't really changed that. As Schwaber says, it shines a bright light on your problems, but it doesn't really, there are a lot of problems it doesn't fix, and it does not fix the long-standing problem of needing to get clear requirements and a clear product vision. And so actually, I think, is not really a knock on Scrum. It's basically thinking that Scrum is going to solve some problems that it doesn't solve, and then not doing other work to solve those problems. And so we tend to need vision on our projects. We need a product roadmap. We need a release roadmap, and without those, we're going to have all the problems we would have with or without Scrum. All right, story number 5, and this is the last story. Is that success on small projects doesn't necessarily scale to large projects. And so we have seen many cases where a first project succeeds, and maybe even a second, third, or fourth project succeed, and the organization wants to scale up Scrum to work on larger projects, and the next largest project maybe is one that has multiple sites and 150 people, and they're just not sure how to make that happen. And so maybe they try it, maybe it doesn't work. We've seen some cases where the organization has succeeded. We've seen some cases where the organization has failed. So what happened here? Well, I think first of all, when we scale up Scrum to 150 people, we're trying to do something that Scrum wasn't really designed for. Back in 2001, 2002, we weren't trying to do Scrum with 150 people. It was a method for managing top flow or top level workflow at the team level. And I think if you take to heart this definition that Scrum is a method for managing top-level workflow at the team level, it explains some of the failures that we've seen. And when you try to scale up Scrum to a 150-person project, that's just not what Scrum is designed for. It's not for managing workflow at the 150-person multiple geo project level. It's for managing workflow at the team level, meaning the 5, 6, 7-person level, but not really above that. And so basically, what we're saying is Scrum is a great solution for the problem it's designed to solve, but that does not make it a great solution for every problem, including the problem of very large projects. Now, the sort of textbook answer of how to scale up Scrum, which has been for years, has been Scrum of Scrums. In our experience, we have not found this to be a terribly effective approach, or at least we've seen it fail fairly often. And I think the reason for that is that Scrum of Scrums basically puts the interface for multiple projects or multiple pieces of projects at the process level. And what we've seen is that really that interface primarily needs to be at, guess what, at the requirements level. because that's where projects tend to fall apart, not just requirements broadly construed, but when we try to parcel out requirements to different parts of a project and we try to coordinate that work, that seems to be where the projects fail. And this, again, this is not new. This is a common, familiar pattern that's been in the industry for 20 years or 40 years for a very long time. And one of the things that we see in Agile projects, and this is not specifically Scrum now, but is more generally Agile, is a fear of non-Agile practices. But the reality is, as we scale up to larger projects, we need to bring in some traditional project management practices that have been shown to work in larger projects, and we should not be afraid of those. We should be willing to supplement the dyed-in-the-wool Agile practices with these more traditional practices that are needed to succeed. And that includes needing more product owners, needing more architecture work, needing more planning and communication. And back to something I originally published 18 years ago in Code Complete, which I've also included in the second edition of Code Complete, which is just look at the kinds of work that you need on projects of different size. On very small projects, 2/3 of the work can be what I've called software construction. By the time you get to larger projects, it's more like 1/3 of the work that goes into construction, and 2/3 of the work goes into other kinds of activities. And so Scrum is really focused mostly on the construction activity. It absorbs a little bit of integration, I think, and a little bit of testing, but not all of it. And so there's just a lot of the graph on the right side of this picture that Scrum is not designed to address. The other thing I think about when I think about large projects versus small projects and Scrum is I think about an essay that the naturalist Stephen Jay Gould wrote, where he talks about two little girls who are standing on the playground talking. And one of the little girls says, "What if a spider was as big as an elephant? Wouldn't that be scary?" And the other little girl says, "Well, if a spider was as big as an elephant, it would look like an elephant, silly." And so Stephen Jay Gould takes that and says, well, let's take a look at that statement and see whether it's true. And he says, if you're a spider, you're the size of a spider, your main concerns are things like desiccation. You're mainly worried about drying out. That's a big deal if you're an arachnid or an insect. And he says, also, at the size of a spider, gravity is not really a concern. You don't have enough mass for gravity to be a factor. Surface tension is actually a bigger factor if you're a spider than gravity is, which is why you see 8 legs on this thing and they're skinny, because they need to be able to overcome the surface tension. In contrast, by the time you get to be the size of an elephant, you've got more significant issues to worry about. There's enough mass there that you don't care at all about surface tension. You care a lot about gravity, and so you've got to have big, thick legs to hold up the mass that you have. You've got to worry about heating and cooling, and so that really thick skin that the elephants have, which is insulation that helps to regulate their internal temperature, is there because of that. And he said, actually, the second little girl is right. If a spider was as big as an elephant, it really would look like an elephant, because there are reasons that something the size of an elephant has to be built the way it is for it to work. And so I apply that same kind of distinction to large Scrum projects, which is if I look at traditional large projects, there are reasons that you see the kinds of practices on those large projects that you see, because to some degree, for a project to work at that size, you got to have certain practices that we have learned over the last 30-plus years in software to make large projects succeed. And so, and likewise, you can do without a lot of those at small projects, and it's fine. You don't need them because the forces that you're concerned about on small projects are actually different. So, to summarize, let's summarize by talking about how to tap into the power of Scrum. I think the keys to success that we've seen in this talk are, if at first you don't succeed, go back to first principles. Read the manual. Make sure that you're doing Scrum by the book if it isn't working for you. Second, remember that Scrum's area of applicability is workflow management at the team level. If you're using Scrum and it's not working for you, ask the question, are you trying to make it solve a problem that's something other than workflow management at the team level? And if we're expecting it to solve some other problem, maybe we're thinking that it can do more than it really can. Number 3, realize that having a vision, a product roadmap, and release roadmap are key to avoiding the most common Scrum failure modes. Scrum doesn't solve traditional requirements problems. those are still there. We still need to do some work to make sure that requirements are kept in check. And fourth, consider where you are on the innovation adoption curve. If you're in an innovator position or an early adopter position, recognize that the factors that lead to success will look one way. If you're in early majority or late majority, either as an individual or as teams within an organization, or maybe even as a whole organization, then what you're going to need to put in place to support teams to be successful is going to be more extensive in those early majority and late majority categories than in innovator or early adopter. And finally, remember the story about the elephant. It explains a lot. As you scale up, remember to phase in traditional large project management best practices, and those can go a long way toward helping avoid the problems that we've seen in companies that have tried to scale Scrum. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and open the floor to questions.
Great, Dave. It was a really thought presentation. Really appreciate that. We're going to dive into the questions because we have quite a few from quite an engaged audience here, so we'll get right to it. First one, the question is, what are your thoughts on a hybrid approach that couples Scrum with other Agile and non-Agile methodologies?
Well, I think that I kind of answered that, or tried to answer that during the talk. I think hybrid approaches as we get into larger projects are not only allowable, I think they're necessary, that we need larger project practices as we get into larger projects. The other comment I'd make about hybrid approaches is I think you want to start with core Scrum practices, that is by the book Scrum, make sure that that's working. And then once you're sure it's working, then you can try to optimize by adding additional practices, but always doing retrospectives to make sure those practices are in fact moving you forward. So I think the end game in any organization is having Scrum that is adapted to the needs of the organization. But I don't think that's where you start. You start, and I think you get 80% of the benefit of Scrum from by the book Scrum. And then you can get another 20% by adding local adaptations. You don't want to start with local adaptations because you don't have enough experience really to know what you're doing. And I think you run the risk of not getting even the first 80%, and certainly not the second 20%.
To kind of go to the core of, we do a lot of interviews here, on Agile, and you have the real religious types, dogmatic people that say you must. And then you have other people who say, well, yeah, we used to be there, but now we're kind of saying adapt it to your practices and it'll be more effective. And as long as you're gaining efficiencies in your software development, it doesn't matter if you're following, every rule step by step or kind of adapting it a little bit. I think that's what you're saying.
I think that's kind of what I'm saying, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, moving right on to the next question. What is the best metrics that a Scrum team can provide so that we can get management support? Is showing a velocity chart the most important thing?
Let's see. I'll make sure I understand that question. I think velocity chart is helpful. I think that, I go kind of, in this one I go back to the Agile Manifesto. I think working software really is the best evidence of progress. So I think it's definitely helpful to show management evidence of progress. And the question used the word metrics specifically, but I would broaden that and say evidence of progress. A velocity chart is one kind of evidence of progress. Working software is another kind of evidence of progress. Happy users are another kind of evidence of progress. Satisfied business partners or enthusiastic business partners are another kind of evidence of progress. So, do I think velocity chart is the most important? Well, I guess I'm not really sure what's meant by velocity chart. I think a release burn down chart is
burn down, right?
Is good because you actually map out the whole. If you actually have committed to a feature set, which we think is important, and in the vast majority of cases, then with the release burn down chart, you are showing steady progress toward the goal. And so I do think that's a very good indicator, especially when you combine it with working software and business partners that are enthusiastic about the progress you made at a more subjective level and so on.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Another question that we have here: do the companies speaking about incorporate traditional on those practices prior to engaging?
Yeah, sorry that your voice cut out there right after the first couple of words on that question.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Yeah. No. The question is, if the companies you were speaking about, I guess, in your stories, if they were incorporating traditional Agile and Scrum roles and practices, and if they were trained on those practices prior to engaging with you guys.
Companies that we engage with, are they trained on traditional Agile and Scrum roles? I think that's all over the map. Like I said in the beginning part of my talk, we don't tend to be brought into a company for the very first Scrum project. We tend to be brought in after the company has dipped its toe in the water and after it's had a handful of people that have done a little bit of trailblazing. We don't really see a lot of exposure to what the very first Scrum implementation in a company looks like. So I would say, based on what we hear after we do come into companies, that the first teams tend to mostly train themselves. Maybe they go to a conference, but mostly they read books and kind of figure it out on their own. And so that really is the challenge, because that works okay for the really highly motivated trailblazing team, but it doesn't tend to provide anywhere near enough support for the teams that come after the highly motivated trailblazing team. And I think those later teams really usually require training, which is one of the services my company provides. They may require ongoing coaching, and certainly as you start outside of the sort of the initial envelope of applicability of Scrum, getting the larger projects, multiple geos, and so on, teams tend to need help kind of figuring out how to make that work with Scrum. So we've seen all different permutations. Some definitely work better than others, but by the time we get there, there's usually some aspect of it that's not working that great. So
right.
So that's just the vantage point that we happen to have.
So going back to the slide that you showed with the green curve of where you guys usually come in along the path.
Yeah, that's right.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, that kind of segues nicely into the next question. You'd mentioned multi-geo, and the next question is, we're in a multi-geo situation. Our developers tend to be stateside while QA is overseas. Can we still use Scrum? And in parentheses, they write, local Scrum proponents say no. What are your thoughts?
Well, that's an interesting question, and this is presented as a Scrum question, but I'm going to interpret it less as a Scrum question and just more as a organizational structure question.
Right.
We don't tend to see, occasionally we'll see stateside development, overseas QA work, but I would say in our experience, at least 3/4 of the time when development work is structured in that way, it creates a lot of problems, and we don't tend to see that work long term very often. It puts the ownership, it distributes the ownership of the work in a funny way. It creates lengthy feedback cycles between the developers and the QA. It accentuates the existing us versus them issues that we often see with development in QA. It accentuates the second-class citizen aspect of QA that we see a lot of the time as well. So in terms of the organizational structure question, it would be a pretty rare case where we would recommend structuring the work in that way. Now, to the actual question that was asked, can we still use Scrum? I think it's a case where, you could probably still use Scrum for the stateside work. You can still get people on the phone or on a WebEx or some other kind of conference facility. The time zone fatigue tends to wear on teams after a while because somebody's going to be getting up early or staying up late, depending on where it is overseas. And there are going to be communication issues, so I don't know. This to me is a situation where I think the baseline description of developer stateside and QA overseas, I think that baseline description puts some really severe limits on how successful that's going to be, and adding Scrum to it actually kind of a second order consideration.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. As I had mentioned actually in my introduction also, we had that situation where the Agile guy, people wanted to know if they could do Agile over distributed teams, and the guy said, well, it's hard, but it's hard to do a lot of things over distributed teams, not just doing Agile development. Yeah,
exactly.
good point. Okay, looking at the next question. This is a good one. Any suggestions for Scrum adoption in a more command and control organization where managers do not always see themselves as coaches and aren't necessarily well suited to being Scrum masters?
I would kind of go back to first principles on this question. I'm not sure that the managers not being Scrum masters is all that relevant. I mean, in Scrum, the Scrum master owns the Scrum process. That doesn't make the person the HR manager. So I think that in a command and control organization, this actually is a good example of a situation where I think if somebody has maybe drunk the Agile Kool-Aid circa 2002 and refuses to provide predictability or schedule or that kind of thing, then that's going to fail miserably in a command and control organization. But if you shift it ever so slightly and you realize that we actually can populate our product backlog early, we can do a release burn down chart, we can track velocity of our team, and we can use that to calibrate our team's productivity and improve the accuracy of our estimates and improve our predictability. We've seen command and control organizations where Scrum actually works great because it actually, compared to the level of predictability that it's possible to get with waterfall, if you do it right in Scrum, you can dramatically improve the predictability that you get out of Scrum compared to a traditional waterfall project. So, I think it's all about the philosophy of the team that adopts Scrum. If they adopt it with the philosophy of flexibility above everything else, this is not going to go well in this kind of organization. But if they adopt it with an eye toward how business wants them to operate, they can actually better serve the business than they have in the past.
Great. Okay, I just want to let everybody know we're getting close to the hour, but we have so many good questions that, Steve, if you don't mind hanging out a little while longer, we can go a little longer and get to more of these questions.
Yeah, sure.
All right. Okay, this next question segues beautifully from the point you were making. My understanding is that predictability with Scrum comes only after a team has enough sprints to feel confident in estimation and velocity. You recommend providing predictability early to earn trust. How do Scrum teams provide early predictability?
Yeah, there I think are two questions in this question. We have seen that once a team is spun up on Scrum, so it's not struggling with the basics of how to do Scrum, but it understands the core practices and so on, that typically a team that conducts 2 iterations, once it's up and running on Scrum, that will give a velocity number that's pretty darn accurate for the entire rest of the project. And the interesting thing about that is whether your iterations are a month or whether they're 2 weeks, you can still get that kind of calibration of your team's velocity. So, so if you're doing biweekly iterations, you spend 1 or 2 iterations just to kind of get the practices down, then you do a couple in more normal operating mode. Now you're 2 months into the project. You should have really good calibration of your team's velocity at that point. So that's kind of part one of the answer. It doesn't take that many sprints to feel confident in the estimation and velocity. Now the second part of the question I really think is a different question, where I said I recommend providing predictability early to earn trust. That's not quite what I meant to say. What I meant to say was really tied to that slide where I said it's better, businesses would rather be wrong than vague. And I think early on, and we all know that with waterfall projects, we're often far off on our estimates. So nobody is saying that we're losing predictability with Scrum versus waterfall. We know that waterfall predictability isn't that good. So all we're saying really is if we've been putting a stake in the ground in the past with waterfall projects, we go ahead and we still put that stake in the ground as we take on our first Scrum project. At that point, it's probably not going to be any more accurate than it would have been with the waterfall project, but it's probably not going to be any less accurate either. And the benefit we get is that in a waterfall project, we might have to go for months and months and months before we were able to update our estimates and improve the accuracy of where that stake really needs to go. Whereas with a well-run Scrum project, after we've done a small number of iterations, we should be in a really good position to take another look at that steak and say, you know what, this really needs to move to this other place. So I'm not saying on very early implementation of Scrum that you're going to get a big benefit in degree which you're wrong rather than vague, but you get early warning as you get the Scrum implementation underway, and then for future projects after that, your ability to estimate should have improved quite a bit. So that steak isn't a lot better, but the second, third, fourth steaks, those should be quite a bit better.
Mm-hmm. All right. We'll take the next question. Can a project organization successfully employ Scrum on a project that includes target hardware development in parallel with the software development? And if so, can you provide some guidance in how that may be done?
Yeah, that really is a great question. We work an awful lot with companies that are doing combined software and hardware initiatives or product development, and so this is an issue that we have seen many times. I think here there are always going to be challenges that come up from the combination of hardware and software, and Scrum is not enough of a magic bullet to solve all of the problems that arise from doing combined hardware-software development. The answer on Scrum really kind of goes back to the same answer I just gave on the last question, which is if you do Scrum right, you can do it in a way that adds predictability to the software side of the equation. It's not going to fix any issues on the hardware side of the equation, but it's going to fix issues on the software side of the equation, or make things more predictable on the software side of the equation. So that helps. That helps some. The other thing that Scrum helps with is Schwaber's point about Scrum not solving all your problems but shining a bright light on where they are. We've seen cases where the adoption of Scrum on the software side helps to shine a light on what the real impact on the software side is of maybe some lack of predictability or lack of control on the hardware side. And it's caused, and we've seen a couple cases where it's caused the organization to wake up and say, wow, we're letting the tail wag the dog here in terms of the money we spend on hardware development versus the money we're spending on software development. And so that's a case where, we've seen it both ways. We've seen some companies look at it and say, yes, this is a problem, we want to solve it. We've seen other companies that are more in the category of the software people look at it and say, wow, look how clear this problem is now. And the company overall doesn't agree. And because it's a hardware-based company, they might say, well, okay, this is just a problem the software people have to deal with, so go off and deal with it. So those are kind of the variations we've seen. But I think, on the software side, Scrum can still be helpful, whether it helps you overcome all the hardware problems or not.
Great. All right, so we're into really what I guess would be the final minute. So, Steve, I'll just kind of throw it back to you for any final takeaways or anything you want to emphasize. If people leave with one or two key points, maybe you might just sum those up briefly.
Well, I guess the point I would make is that we really are a lot further down the road in 2011 than we were in 2001 and 2002, and so I would really encourage people to, if you want to read about this, make sure that what you're looking at is current, not even, if possible, not even 5 years old. Make sure that it's more recent than that, because we have learned a lot of lessons even in the last 5 years and certainly in the last 10 years. And while I think the core advice from the stuff that was out 10 years ago, the core of it is good, I think there are enough nuances that we've learned a lot about since then that I would gravitate toward more recent learnings. And certainly my company we have some white papers that describe our learnings on Scrum. I would encourage people to take a look at those and point your friends to this webinar.
People pointed out in the Q&A about you talking about doing by-the-book Scrum, and they were wondering, well, what book is that? And I guess you just answered that by saying try to find more recent information. But is there a real good guide that people getting started could turn to?
Well, I think if you look at the materials, the center of gravity of Scrum in my mind is Ken Schwaber and Mike Cohn. And so the stuff from those guys, I think, is sort of the canonical description of Scrum. So I would start with either or both of those guys.
Great. Super. Okay, well, I would certainly like to thank Steve McConnell and Construx for joining us for this webinar today. And certainly I would like to thank all of our attendees for spending an hour this afternoon with us. On behalf of SD Times, once again, I'd like to thank everyone. And until next time, take care. Bye-bye.